Welcome to the Evolving Leadership Development Podcast. Each episode brings you fresh perspectives from thinkers and practitioners who are redefining leadership in the age of AI.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Evolving Leadership Development Podcast. I am your host, Panos Malakoudis, and today, hopefully, we're also coming to you through LinkedIn. So let's see if that works, and we're grateful for all the engagement, all the questions that you will put here on the LinkedIn chat. Today, I'm pretty happy to have Dr. Simon Uttley here with me. We have a fascinating topic for which I will talk to you in a second. But let me first introduce Simon. So Dr. Simon Uttley is an ICF coach. He's a professor of education at the University of Notre Dame in the US. He is here in London. Dr. Simon is also an educational leader with 26 years of leadership experience. He is the founding CEO of 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬.org. We will give you the link at the description. 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬.org is a values-driven educational research community bringing together academics, practitioners, and policymakers from across the globe. It's pretty amazing work that Simon does there. Simon is also the executive chair and co-founder of the Slovak Educational Leadership Conference, which I didn't know up until I had that conversation with Simon. Now that is in its 10th year, and it is at the heart of educational innovation in the region. With that being said, Simon, welcome to this episode together.
Panos, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So Simon, recently we had a conversation around something that I found really fascinating. And you were almost surprised that I found it fascinating. So when I said, I'd love to learn more about this notion, like a couple of days later, a paper was written and it was published on social media. And we will share the paper that you've written because it's accessible to anyone. I got it right here. And the paper was titled Implications for Coaching in Developing Leadership. So that was a subtitle. The title was An Analysis of Silence, Shadow, and Rest. And the conversation we had, I was telling you about how my teenage daughter was doing art, and there were so many notions, and we started talking about poetry. And you were pretty confident. You were saying, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I've written articles about this. So tell me a little bit more about silence and shadow and rest, and how on earth does it link to leadership development?
Thanks, Panos. Yeah, that's a good summary of our conversation. I think there's always been a strong privileging of kind of presence within leadership conversations. It's about saying things, and it's also an element of what the philosophers call emotivism. I'll say something to make you feel a particular kind of way, and that will therefore meet my strategic needs and so on. And this idea about really authentic communication compared to inauthentic communication, to me, is very much about avoiding the noise, avoiding the excessive noise around in the way that we speak in a leadership context. So much as it can make us feel good to listen to messianic speeches from charismatic leaders, sometimes it's something of a sugar rush. It feels good. It stays with us for half an hour and then it dissipates. Whereas I think for me, in terms of any conversation of merit, leadership, managerial, even interactive between, people in a domestic context, the more we strip away the noise, the cleaner the language, an expression there from the world of coaching, of course, the more likely we are to really kind of convey something to somebody else, and also to do it in such a way that I suppose we're privileging their dignity as well as our desire to be heard. So I think there's something in this whole thing around cleaning up our communication, which has a moral element, but is also, in my view, more efficacious. And I'm sure I'll come on to this. I've been inspired by that from the world of art and the world of music as well. So this thing around authenticity in communication seems to be something which I've seen in the best leaders in my 26 years experience, and it's something which I think we can learn to do once we let go of this northern hemisphere obsession with filling the bandwidth with presence, performativity and the rest of it, which I think can be both exhausting and in some respects rather futile.
Both Western Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, and Western culture as well. And the fascinating thing about what you're suggesting here, which feels true, is that it's not the first time, the coaching industry and the learning and development industry and the leadership development industry is talking about how can we bring art in leadership development. I have been talking for many years about the power of poetry in using rather universal language in conveying life's biggest conundrums, and how leaders would definitely benefit from practicing, reading or writing poetry. There's a school of thought that says that theater improvisation classes are an amazing leadership development methodology because you learn how to react in uncertainty. But I'll be honest, I had never thought about the use of pause and the use of absence and the use of quiet in that context. That was honestly pretty new to me. So what is the best example? And I know you have a couple. What is the first example you have for us to use as a metaphor almost about here's how it worked with art and here's how a leader can learn from that example?
Well, if we're thinking from the world of art, and there's lots of examples, this school of chiaroscuro, this idea of lightness and darkness, and very famous painters like Caravaggio and also Rembrandt, one of my favourite, employed this technique to great effect in their times as well. So this idea that there is a deep story, there is a deep hinterland reflected in the apparent lack of anything, the darkness, the quiet, as it were, which brings everything else to light. One of my favorite Rembrandts is the Prodigal Son, for example, where there's this darkness behind the principal kind of actors within this space, which suggests a complexity of feelings. It carries with it an ambiguity of purpose, an ambiguity of spirit, and maybe even a moral ambiguity on the part of some of the people who are looking on. And none of that is explicit. None of that is written into the text. There's no positivism there. It's all in that use of darkness and the use of, and where the spotlight is put on by Rembrandt in that picture. And there's lots of other examples as well of that idea. So for me, that makes me very much think within the world of leadership, the way in which we should, yes, of course, be laser focused on the issues that we think are important and that matter as well, but also credit our listeners with the space to reflect on how they have encountered our message. Again, from the world of philosophy, this idea of phenomenology. Doesn't matter what I'm saying to you, Panos, it's what you receive from me that matters ultimately. And there can be this idea, I think, in some leaders, especially when they become rather conditioned into their own modality, that their assumption of what the recipient is receiving from them becomes distorted. We would say in a rather colloquial sense, they like the sound of their own voice. And I think the danger there is that they lose touch with actually how they are received by other people. So I think there's that whole thing there about spotlighting what we want to say based on a deep understanding of how our recipients receive us, and a privileging of the fact that they will receive us in different ways, which are individual to them, which have cultural individuality as well, and the rest of it. So there's that side of it there, I think, from the world of art, and equally music too. Beethoven's Fifth, for example, the famous da 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 da, and the start of that piece of music, and so on. The use of those rests within music, and any musician would testify to this. Those rests are not the absence of the melody or the music in sense. Those rests are what brings everything else to life. So this idea of rest and space and pause and apparent nothingness as being fundamentally dynamic in bringing something to life. Think of the way Miles Davis, one of my favorite jazz musicians, will warp the kind of space-time in which we're listening to his music, bending those words around in a way that really moves our spirits. Extraordinary, and that's the great thing about great jazz. Some people don't like jazz. I happen to quite like jazz. So there is a deep sense in which using that space and those gaps and so on itself can really move the recipient and can really convey. And I think I'll just make one more point as well here, as you kindly said in that introductory bio, and thank you for that, Panos. My leadership has been particularly in education for over a quarter of a century, and that idea of the difference and I think for me this is fundamental, the difference between education as knowledge transfer, which of course AI does rather well, and education as the possibility of wisdom. And that to me seems to be a profoundly different proposition. And that idea of wisdom, philosophia, the love of wisdom, philosophy, but that idea of wisdom in young people, in the students at Notre Dame, students in my school and so on, that idea of wisdom itself comes from the blend of the presence and the apparent absence, because it comes from what they receive and what they themselves invest into what they receive in their own silence. So the phenomenology of receiving the education that we give them. And I think just really respecting that whole thing about how people receive things and what they invest into it themselves, rather than us assuming that what we give them is necessary and sufficient. I think there's something there that really brings out the dignity of the recipients, but also allows them to create real wisdom, not merely to be recipients of knowledge transfer, which I think is a rather more arid and sterile understanding of what knowledge is all about.
And there will be for sure knowledge transfer, right? And as leaders,
Absolutely.
we sometimes educate and inform people. But it's what you said. Well, do we create the space for that phenomenon to come to the surface? Do we create the space for the people to absorb and appreciate? And as coaches, we do it very often. But what I find fascinating here in the leadership development practice is also what you said about not only people need the space to absorb, but also that pause creates focus. That pause tells you, look there. And just before our call, I said, I fired up YouTube and I put Beethoven's Fifth and I listened to that. But for the first time, after that was the effect of me reading your paper, I heard it differently. That pause was deafening. That pause say, hold on, pay attention. Are you here? Are you ready to witness this? Right? So that emptiness, that pause really said, pay attention. Something important is happening here. And as I am coaching many leaders, quite often the topic that is coming up in this coaching session with the leaders is the topic of presence and executive presence and influence, and how am I being perceived inside the boardroom and inside the meeting room. And something that comes very often is exactly this. I feel the need to just provide the answer immediately. And it is really a paradox, because the moment, my favorite coaching question in this situation, Simon, is, well, imagine the leaders that you admire. Imagine them, or remember how you experience them in the boardroom, in the meeting room. Do they rush to immediately provide an answer? And everybody, 100% of the time, the answer is no. They take their time. I said, okay, and how do you perceive them when they take the time to answer and they don't respond immediately? Do you perceive them as somebody that doesn't know what's happening and they have to think about it? They say, no, I perceive them as somebody who's mindfully thinking, what is the most impactful way to convey that message? I don't feel that they're lacking confidence. The opposite. They broadcast that confidence through that silence. But it is fascinating how our knee-jerk reaction is to immediately fill that gap instead of looking at it as, like you say in the article, as something that is generative.
Absolutely. And I think, I think that unfortunately there's develops over a period of time, I suppose, a real fear of silence,
Yeah.
And, whether within, say, my own country here in the UK, whether we date this back to the Enlightenment or late Enlightenment or Industrial Revolution or whatever, I think there is a fear of that kind of thing, and that a need to sort of fill that, and that, again, that privileging of presence over apparent absence in a way. And I mean, certainly in my own leadership, I do try and, literally, and it may or may not be helpful, but I try and hardwire in opportunities for reflection during very ordinary business interactions. And when you do that for the first time with some people who've not had that experience before, it can be quite discombobulating to them, okay? Or to use a kind of a zeitgeist word, it can be quite disrupting. But I think it's worth doing. And I've seen people who've gone through that process, and afterwards they've really been taken by it. And I've done quite a bit of work with Quaker institutions, interestingly enough. And of course, Quaker institutions really privilege this idea of silence and quiet. It's extraordinary. And they will literally, that is hardwired into all of their meetings. And I think there's a real strength in that approach. And from that, that there is a spiritual tradition, and I mention this only because I think it's got relevance. There's a great line I once heard, which is, silence is the sound that God makes. But I think that's an interesting point for us within the leadership context as well. Let's not forget what's possible when we move beyond privileging our own performative language as leaders and actually maximize the bandwidth within the 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 people around us by providing them that time for reflection and allowing to really draw back the feedback. Now, as we know, in any business context, the way we manage feedback and review itself can be overly managed. We can curate it for our own ends. It can be manipulated and all the rest of it, and that's true. But I think even just to hardwire that time for reflection, that time for, another word, contemplation, can draw out incredible richness from the people with whom we're working. And again, I come back to what I said before. It also recognizes not only their dignity as members of our team, but also their depth of experience as well. So I think that is an important thing. And again, back to the point before about Rembrandt and this idea of the darkness allowing the kind of laser sharpness of the use of light, the light that comes in from the side. It's also a very good way of emphasizing the things that we regard as important in leadership without moving into hyperbole, moving into overly dramatic language, dramatic nonverbal communication. Just that sense of quiet and silence can be a very countercultural way of saying what we're talking about now, people, is profoundly important. But I don't need to use hyperbole or impose my ego to make that point to you. We're going to instead use silence and the bandwidth of this group of people with their incredible experience and wisdom to sort of gently move into this space. I hope that kind of makes some sense in a way, because for me, that's certainly been my experience of leadership over the years, where I've seen it work really, really, really effectively. Being countercultural and actually just providing that space.
Simon, language is dependent on culture. So it's really difficult to find truly universal language and a truly universal way to communicate with language. Is silence universal in its meaning?
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's different ways of people approach it. I go back to the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who famously said, that sort of language is our home. And he wasn't the only person to say that. But we can't step outside of language. We can't do a meta thing in the language that we're born into. And of course, some of us, like yourself, have other languages, and I have some other languages as well. But the language that you're born into, that is your home. In a sense, you can't step outside it. So the one way that you can disrupt that all-encompassing sort of framing of language is by stopping talking, in a way. It doesn't stop us thinking and perhaps using our home language to articulate things. But I think that whole thing about stopping talking and just letting things just be for a while without the need to convert them into performative language seems to be quite strong. I mean, that Taoist idea of Wu Wei, this effortless, non-directive action, challenging the assumption that the authority has to be demonstrated by speech is an interesting one from a different cultural milieu. And Merleau-Ponty's sort of, again, phenomenology of perception, this argument that meaning comes from the interplay between speech and the silent background against which it becomes intelligible. That's another thought. Speech is powerful because it sits within silence. Musical notation is powerful because it sits within silence. It has no efficacy without the silence in which it subsists. something that we often forget. So I think there's probably something fairly universal in that recognition, that silence provides that powerful role. But what I do know is that particularly within, quote unquote, advanced capitalist societies, I think has been a strong movement towards filling the bandwidth with language and performativity and inspirational messages and motivational speeches and so on. That's been very much part of our experience. And I think this idea, and again, it comes from a variety of religious and spiritual traditions, this idea of, and business uses it too, having a retreat, whether literally going away for a couple of days and reflecting on our business and our values or whatever, or building that into our meetings, the way that the Quakers do, the way that I try and do as well sometimes. There seems to be something there that really has a value to it. And I think it's just about having the confidence to do it. And I think one of the things there, and obviously we both work with leaders and also some young leaders or new leaders, is it can seem scary as a new leader not to sound as if you know everything about what you do. And of course, the real wisdom that comes years later is recognizing that you're not there to know everything. You're there to provide a beacon and a guidance, and you're there to hire great people who know lots of things that you don't know. That's part of the leadership role. But you're not there to be the fount of all knowledge. And I think, again, this idea of silence and this idea of quiet reflection, showing the dignity to the team and the people around you, is actually a very strong leadership gesture. It's not a signal of weakness or inexperience. It's a strong leadership gesture, just like, Panos, and you know this very, very well, some leaders and managers, particularly in the culture in which we're operating, they might think that coaching is something you do when you don't know very much. Early on, you don't know what to do, so you need a coach, and then you learn it, and you don't need one anymore. Which is why I always remind them, think Wimbledon tennis players. The better they get, the more that coaching is important to them, because ultimately coaching is not about teaching someone who doesn't know anything what to do. There's a bit of mentoring there, perhaps, but coaching is a different thing as well. And I think that great leaders, not only do great leaders have coaches, in my experience, but also great leaders recognize that they need to be constantly challenged by, for example, a coach partly to provide the silence on which they can write the musical notation of their own leadership. So that, for me, is another way of seeing what the coach is.
I love it. Silence is generating. Silence is fertile. And silence, you're almost describing silence as a scaffold of sorts, of creating everything. So it's what you need the pauses. But I really want to, I'm looking at my notes here because I really want you to talk a little bit, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, about 𝐸𝐸 and 𝐸𝐸, which has to do with that, with authenticity. So tell us a little bit about that, because I found it fascinating. I found all our conversations fascinating, but this is, again, something I had never heard before.
So this comes out of Martin Heidegger's work and others as well. It's going to be any Heidegger scholars out there, just to be fair to them as well. He's talking about it in a very particular, nuanced way. But the way it's been used and developed and made more accessible, essentially, is that we're all in authenticity and inauthenticity all the time. And inauthenticity does not mean that we're not honest or not genuine or whatever. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that for a lot of the time, we're in that normal, performative, just getting on with life kind of thing. We're being polite in the supermarket. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. It's not a bad thing to do as well. We're having a conversation with someone. We're having a domestic conversation, whatever it might be. And that's a mixture of authentic and inauthentic. Part of it is just the noise of engaging with people. And some of that noise is, well, I've got 5 minutes to talk to you. I'll scaffold this conversation such that at the end of it, I can get out and go and do something else. That's an inauthenticity that we might use. Do we do it? Yes, of course we do. Is it a bad thing? No, it's not. So this is not a moral thing, authentic and inauthentic in Heidegger's term in that sense. But I do think this idea of inauthenticity as leaning into the obsession for performativity. Again, it's the I will do this thing so that you can see me doing it. So the value of what I'm doing here is predominantly in the fact that you can witness me doing it, not what this offers you as the person with whom I'm engaging. And I think in a sense that's how this idea has been moved into this space around leadership. I'm slightly adapted from Heidegger's original thinking, but this idea I think is quite powerful. And it comes back to what we talked about before. So we know in management speak, you pick up any book in an airport lounge or whatever, and you read about it. You've got all sorts of wonderful warm words. It was particularly a thing in the 80s and the 90s as well. But lots of warm words, lots of attractive ways in which we can capture our audience and be successful and so on. And there's some really good advice, and it's absolutely fine. But it's very much focused on what I will do. I am the agent of all of this, and so on. So the danger with this, I think, is that we're constantly, in our interaction with other people, we're looking into a virtual mirror. We're speaking, we're engaging, but actually we're looking into a mirror. It's almost like, how am I sounding to myself? Skillful are my words? How articulate do I sound? How is the use of language here really warm and impressive, and so on? And it's not about narcissism particularly, but it becomes so focused on our own performativity that we forget not only the people we're speaking to, and that can be impolite, but back to what we said before, we forget the fact that their reading of an interaction with what we're saying can be profoundly different to what we intend, and can be profoundly richer if we give them the time and space to engage with what we've said. Now, the way in leadership and management for the last decades or so that we've tried to address this is things like 360 appraisals and so on, where we've said, oh, Panos, what do you think about my leadership style? And we can use all sorts of tools, can't we, to do that? And that's great. I think that's really good, and I've done that as well. I think it's a really good thing to do. I enjoy doing that, and it's great, and so on. But rather than waiting for a once a year 360 review, again, if that can be hardwired into our interactions, whether it is by providing literally space and silence within meetings and so on, like the Quakers do and others, whether it's by just thinking, our documents and our policy statements, how much do we actually need in those documents and policy statements that we write? Who are we writing them for? Are we writing them so that we can say, look at my articulate, eloquence here, or are we doing it for another reason? So what about policy statements that leave a space, that leave a gap for people to do their own thinking? So almost, this is what we want to achieve. What will that look like to you in your department, Panos? What could that look like to you? What could the opportunities be there? What could the threats be there? And literally leave a gap, just like in Beethoven's Fifth, just like in the darkness in Rembrandt and Caravaggio. Leave a gap in that communication, whether it's a podcast, a policy statement, a video, a speech. Leave a gap and allow the recipients to do the work and allow them to engage with that. And they can write things down and so on, however you want to do it. But it's extraordinary what you get from that, really. And it's extraordinary what they get from as well. And it's deep engagement. I think very often in business, we talk about consultation. We've consulted with people. Have we? Or have we said, this is what we're going to do. What do you think? Thank you for your opinion. Goodbye. All right. That's not consultation. That's pretend politeness. Whereas if we deeply invest in the people that we're working with and provide that gap, that space there, okay, that's the authenticity there, drawing from that Heidegger idea, provide that space that is a risk to us because we're not fully in control of the space. Not only is that extremely creative, but again, for me, that shows the leader to be properly strong, properly powerful, not macho, performative, messianic ego, and so on. Okay? Does that help? Hopefully it does.
Yes, and it is a perfect way for us to land the plane today, because we can talk about this thing, forever. You even made my job a lot easier, Simon, because I was just about to ask you, what is the one thing that leaders can start practicing? And you gave us something very, very specific that leaders can start practicing with, creating that pause, creating that space, being deliberate about it.
Yeah.
Simon, where can people find more about you and about the work that you do? And we'll put all the links on the description as well.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the work we're doing around values-driven research and education, It's 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬, 𝐾OIN -ed. That'll be in the link. 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬 is the enterprise there, and also the link. There's also the link there to the coaching work as well, and articles. Of course, I'm regularly on LinkedIn that link to that space. So LinkedIn and my own website there as well, and always keen to continue this engagement with people. I'm always learning. I'm always benefiting. And I benefit enormously when I shut up and listen as well. That's my truth for me.
Simon, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you, and I can't wait for everything else that you will publish. It's all fascinating. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to all our listeners for being with us today, and see you on the next one.
Great pleasure.